We've seen a lot of Ascendancy information at this point from the early access trailer, but these are the 5 nodes that I've seen so far that get me the most excited about theory crafting for PoE2. The first one I want to talk about is Ravenous Doubts on the Acolyte of Chayula. It gives you Mana Leech as being instant, which I think is insane. Leech is a mechanic that we've always struggled with in PoE. It's sort of an arms race between developer and player, in that Leech can be really OP, especially when it's provided as an instant recovery mechanic. Now, this paired with a new Mind Over Matter that lets you protect 100% of your life with your mana now is insane. It basically means that you don't need to build life at all if you are able to get enough mana. There's also Consuming Questions here, which kind of leads you to think of Acolyte of Chayula as a hybrid mana int defensive shell, which is insanely powerful usually, especially since we don't have life scaling on the tree, but we do have things like increased ES on the tree, and it scales also both at the same time with intelligence as far as int stackers go. The second note I'm super excited about is this unbound encore Ascendancy. It gives you time snap, which is just a button that you press which resets all your cooldowns on Chronomancer. I don't know what the actual cooldown on this particular skill is, but I think it pairs really well potentially with the Hammer of the God skill. It's got a fat 24-second cooldown and a crazy 1307 base effectiveness. But if you pair that with things like Infernal Cry and also Seismic Cry and then other scalers, you're basically ending up, if you have this, with like a 10,000% effectiveness damage skill that's basically the same as hitting an enemy with Bone Shatter 200 plus times right now as far as numbers balancing go. Now obviously you'd have issues with clear and like, is this even playable, where's the tree start, but I think it's a super interesting to think about, especially that core interaction. The higher the cooldown of the skill, the more powerful something like Time Snap will be, because it just resets everything. It doesn't care about what the cooldown is. Even more so if Time Snap is on like, a 10-second cooldown, that's not just, doubling your damage to that. That's not just every 24 seconds you use this twice. That means also it's probably getting closer to tripling your damage for a main hammer build. Something to consider. It could pair out with other skills quite well, but I'm really excited to hope that this maybe does work. The third node I really want to talk about is Judge, Jury, and Executioner. Now, I think that this is a super underrated node. Most people, I think we agree that it's probably something that applies to a monster on full life. If you hit a monster on full life, it'll deal a percent of damage between 1 and 30% of their health. The thing is, that's not like an average 15%, right? When you talk about bosses, most of us are going to be starting in softcore when you're learning bosses. And a lot of you guys will suck and die a lot, and that's fine. With this node, I think you can just like run into a boss, die until you get like a nice big fat 25% plus proc. The other thing to note is that multipliers as far as PoE2 are actually a lot smaller. The more multipliers that we're seeing on the tree are closer to that 15 to 20% mark as opposed to like the 30-40% mark we saw in PoE1. So yeah, possible to underrate this thing. Front-loaded damage is always cool. The one downside is that the second half of bosses is always a little more dangerous than the first half of bosses. So yeah, something to consider there as well. The fourth Ascendancy node that I think could be super interesting is Overwhelming Toxicity. So in current base PoE, Poison is based on 30% of the Fizz and Chaos damage. In PoE2, it's only 25% and it has a cap limit of 1. The reason I bring these numbers up is that in PoE1, Bleed has something like a 70% I think, in terms of the base damage of your Fizz, and it can be aggravated for like 210 or something like that. In PoE2 though, from what we've seen so far, Bleed has a base 15%, stacks one time, and it can be aggravated for an extra 200%. In other words, Bleed gives you 45% on the base. Poison, on the other hand, I think starts at 25%, and from what I've heard, it's not impossible or not even difficult to get up to 5 as your poison cap on like tree or whatever it may be. Now, if people are getting 5 as their cap, that means they're not taking things like Overwhelming Toxicity, because if it doubles the number of poisons, it's always going to be an even number. So basically, I think this could be the strongest dot ailment right off the bat. I'm always excited about poison. I think generally the more awkward or more kind of dank seeming damage scaling type is, the more powerful it tends to be on release in video games. Obviously that less poison duration is not a great thing, but we're talking about poison cap. This could be really strong. I wouldn't contextualize it against current PoE. I would contextualize it against what dots look like in future PoE. Now the rest of the Ascendancy doesn't get me particularly excited, so in a lot of ways I see this as a make or break node. If the pacing of poison works really well, if you're applying somewhere in the range of like 5 to like 15 poisons every 2 seconds or so, then this will be really great. If poison is something that's hitting like 100 times per second, then it's not going to be so powerful, right? The last one that's got me really excited is Answered Call. Now, I don't even know what this really does in a sense. I mean, I've seen the Ancestral Spirit. I saw like a bear run through during the trailer when this was being used. But the biggest thing is that I think passive damage is going to be really important. For the most part, we have bad uptime on bosses in PoE2 so far. The idea of having passive damage just from your totem blasting things all the time is really good, and I just think that totem builds are probably what I'm going to be league starting. I think the current pace in the game is so centric towards dodging that you really want to be having passive damage if possible, and there's only so many sources of that actually exist, like minions, totems, maybe things like Bleeding Knight are kind of like that, but depends on what your actual uptime looks like. So regardless of what Ancestral Spirits already does, I want to play totems. Now I think this will be really good because they wouldn't just add a garbage node for no reason, right? I know it's an incomplete picture that we have right now, but that doesn't mean we can't try to plan for what's in the future and get really excited about all the different ways we might be able to break the game.